Let's talk about omens. Why are they like that? What can we learn from them about the lands between? Omens are graceless beings, most famously born covered in horns. Not only that, but they look rather different from normal humans, especially in that they're larger. Evil spirits haunt their nightmares, though perhaps that's a self-fulfilling prophecy based on their constant persecution. Some are able to conjure yellow-black flame. One famous omen is the demigod Moog, Lord of Blood. If he's any indication, omens have special, fiery blood. His twin Morgoth seems to echo this, trying and ultimately failing to keep his blood contained. We can also learn a lot from the lovely Dung Eater. While he doesn't seem to be an omen himself, he models his armor after a dehorned omen. He himself also uses yellow-black flame to fight, and his infamous seedbed curse sprouts little omen horns. Through this bodily defilement, he somehow causes souls to become cursed, incapable of returning to the Erd Tree. Somewhat confusingly, he says these will nonetheless be reborn, and that this curse will continue to be inherited after that. The heart of an omen without the body to match. Could there be any crueler existence? Just what is this telling us? It indicates that the Dung Eater has the spiritual aspects of an omen. Yellow-black flame projections are called wraiths and are said to be cursed spirits. Omens and the Dung Eater alike seem to be innately haunted by these. This may explain the nightmares. The phrase heart of an omen could even be taken literally. He has the actual heart and the blood that omens have. In addition to the psychic haunting of wraiths, fiery omen blood may cause constant physical torment. It may be something like ceaseless discharge. That's a Dark Souls character in case someone's not aware. The Dung Eater's partially omen-like nature gives us a window into the body-soul dualism present throughout Elden Ring. It's most blatantly thrust into our faces with the duo of the bodiless Ranni and the soulless Godwyn. Actually, the D-Twins' armor description gives us a tantalizing hint of a tripartite distinction among body, soul, and mind. Fascinating though that is, for now I'll mostly stick to exploring the dualism of body and soul. A brief aside to help grasp the nature of souls. Information is an important concept in Elden Ring. Runes, for example, seem to be a form of information. Information isn't made of matter, like a body, but instead has a completely distinct nature from the physical. Souls are another non-physical entity, and souls are able to interact with information. For example, consider a Great Rune. A Great Rune, I believe, is a complex and detailed description of some concept or principle. It is an object in the realm of information. However, it can be attached to a soul. This isn't the same thing as being in the mind of the creature whose soul that is. You can have a Great Rune without mentally comprehending its principle. Otherwise, becoming a tarnished Elden Lord would require very high intelligence, which it certainly doesn't. However, information alone has no effect on matter. When benediction is granted to a Great Rune, ultimately stemming from the Greater Will, the rune is allowed to be used to have physical effects. Now information is having an effect on the physical realm. A more intuitive example is life itself. Souls animate biological matter, acting as a bridge which allows the informational realm to affect the physical realm, and vice versa. When anything puts a soul in contact with physical matter, I will refer to that as binding a soul. Biological life is a very common form of soul binding, but surely isn't the only one. In fact, life seems like a relatively orderly and complex binding. There are simpler ones, and some of these seem to manifest physically as forms of flame. Wraiths, for instance, are souls that are bound rather simply and chaotically in the form of yellow-black flame. Rancor is another similar example. Omens seem to innately perform this type of simplistic binding to wraith souls. I think it's involuntary. The spiritual aspect of omenhood is shared by the Dung Eater. What's the connection, if any, between the spiritual and physical aspects of being an omen? I believe the overarching theme explaining omens is the idea of uncontrolled growth. This explains their large size. They're best known by their horns, and horns are a body part which never stops growing for the entire lifetime of their owner. There is no full size at which they stop. The Greater Will doesn't like this. It only wants controlled, orderly growth. This is why omens are graceless. I speculate they aren't even supposed to survive gestation, but because destined death isn't in the Elden Ring, they reach birth, and can grow up big and strong. Marika, probably accidentally, denied the Greater Will the ability to prune what sorts of people can exist. Just some speculation there. Uncontrolled growth applies not only to the body, but to soul binding. An organism normally builds up a physical means for binding a single soul to itself. One might argue that's the point of life. But an omen does this uncontrollably, and doesn't bind only a single soul. In addition to a relatively normal human soul, they form many simple, chaotic bindings to wraith souls. They can learn to wield these as a weapon, but they're also constantly tormented by them. Vradarika can perhaps detect them emanating from the Dung Eater's phantom. This may help make some sense of the Dung Eater's rather unique approach to identity. His phantom and physical forms act like two different people. Similar, but not identical. And then he tells you, "You are me." What must his subjective experience be like constantly swarms with chaotic cursed souls. Perhaps his consciousness shifts among them. He doesn't identify with any specific body, perspective, or line of thought. Instead, he identifies with the actions that he usually takes. So when he decides you need to do the defiling, he says you are him. Through defilement, the Dung Eater has found a way to spread this spiritual omen nature. I believe he causes his victims to suddenly bind cursed souls, and by proximity, this haunting corrupts the victim's own soul. The haunting also has the physical symptom of sprouting omen horns. It is interesting to compare and contrast with Moog, who also causes his followers to adopt his nature, though seemingly without such extreme effects. Vare is described as exceptional for taming Moog's omen blood and making it fit for sharing. Has the Dung Eater performed a similarly exceptional breakthrough? I have my doubts, and anyway, I don't think it's his blood that the Dung Eater injects his victims with. It does, however, demonstrate an interplay between body and soul. It's physical bodies that the Dung Eater defiles with pox, yet their souls ends up cursed. So the body can affect the soul. These souls are cursed and unable to return to the Earth Tree, but he says they'll be reborn, and also that their own children will be likewise cursed. I find this somewhat confusing, because it leads me to ask, when a child is being born, does it pluck a soul from the ether somehow, or is a new one created, with some sort of guidance from its parents? The Dung Eater's claims seem to imply a mix of both. However, it's possible he's simply mistaken. It's just some claims he's making. How could he know whether some soul or another becomes reborn? And how does he know what its children will be like? Now, his mending rune does back up his claims, but that's a mending rune. Once it's part of the Elden Ring, sure, then it can radiate its effects out and change both the bodies and souls of many beings for generations to come. Apparently the Dung Eater had some inkling that he could achieve the creation of this mending rune, so I think he was just confused in his claims for this reason. He thinks individually defiling people creates a heritable curse, but maybe it doesn't, it just curses that one soul. Only once his efforts change the Elden Ring does this truly become a multi-generational effect. At least, it makes a lot more sense to me to look at it that way. The mending rune is created by defiling the Dung Eater himself with many of his own accursed poxes. I believe the effect of this is to repeatedly increase the amount of chaotic soul binding happening in and around his body. When an extreme quantity of these cursed souls are all interacting with each other within him, they coalesce into the mending rune of the fell curse. I don't think mending runes and great runes are fundamentally all that different. In the far future, a mending rune might even become a new great rune if the Elden Ring is shattered again. So, like a great rune, a mending rune is a detailed description of some principle, and souls are informational entities. So a great concentration of souls, each bearing information, all on the same topic, all in one place, forms into this mending rune. Presumably all mending runes work something like this. That would mean that Goldmask creates a mending rune just using his galaxy brain, with just one soul, by building up such a voluminous and detailed model of reality using his own mind. The amount of coherent information required is the same in both cases, but Goldmask and the Dung Eater gather it in very different ways. Then what about the mending rune of the Death Prince? And more relevantly, what of this yellow-black wraith flame, which I've been associating with omens? Various adherents of Godwyn use magic and effects which have that same fiery yellow-black appearance. There's gotta be more to this story, hasn't there? Where else does this kind of effect show up? The term wraith comes from the wraith calling bell used by revenant worshippers. These worshippers have this effect around them when they appear. The revenants themselves teleport around at will. Other teleporters are the headless guardians of walking mausolea. Some of these have that same flame effect on their weapons. These headless soldiers are protecting headless demigods. Soulless, in fact, just like Godwyn. These await the eclipse, and the center for all things eclipse is Castle Sol. This castle enshrines the eclipse shuttle, whose weapon skill, Death Flare, of course has the same visual effect. In fact, its description directly describes it as the Prince of Death's flames, practically confirming a deep connection to Godwyn. How do all these various entities interrelate? How do omens ever enter this picture? One thing both the Wraith Calling Bell and the omen-like Seedbed Curse agree on is the idea of cursed souls. I once again consider the concept of dualism. Souls can bind to living matter. Death is when the soul becomes unbound. This could happen in various ways. A presumably common one is that the physical means of binding loses its function. In other words, the body breaks down and can no longer hold a soul. This is one way for death to happen, but other ways seem possible too. What if a soul somehow changes and loses the ability to be bound, at least in the normal way? If that happened, the soul would unbind, and that would also cause death, but by entirely different means than killing the body. I believe this is what was meant by killing the soul. Godwyn's soul became corrupted, cursed. It lost the ability to bind normally to physical flesh, while that flesh itself was relatively unharmed. So it went on living, though its soul departed it. So Godwyn's soul became a gigantic cursed soul, much like a wraith. His soul isn't manifesting anywhere in anything like a complete binding, but if it did, it might look just like a giant yellow-black flame. Godwin's various adherents and associates are able to commune with his soul. That's why their magic takes on the same familiar appearance. These are things like Mausoleum Soldier Auras, or Deathblight, or Fortisacks. I'm not saying Godwin originated this, that it didn't exist before his soul became cursed. His cursed soul is just a huge example of the type of effect, which has existed as long as omens have, and possibly quite a bit longer than that. Revenants are another example. Who knows how long they've been around? They seem to be some super esoteric, carrion means of undeath. The resulting being is quite powerful. However, the method is completely incompatible with the Golden Order. They're actually harmed by healing spells. I guess the Erd Tree's healing pushes bodies toward rejecting these souls it considers cursed. Maybe there were many more of these revenants around before the Erd Tree was shining down over everything. But the full story is even more complicated still. After all, Godwin is the source of Deathroot, which creates those who live in death. But those who live in death show no sign of the Prince of Death's flame. Instead, they seem to use a different thing called Ghost Flame. Ghost Flame is heavily associated with the Deathbirds of old. Yet Mausoleum Knights, seemingly connected to Godwin, also explicitly evoke the Deathbirds in the design of their armor. On the surface, it seems things aren't lining up well. Those who live in death don't seem to use the right form of magic, and even if there are two forms, then which of them did the Deathbirds use? But once again, dualism helps explain it all. It makes perfect sense that effects stemming from Godwin's soul use cursed yellow-black flame, while effects stemming from his body instead result in pale ghost flame. Godwin's soul and body are on two very different wavelengths. That's the unique thing about him. As for the Deathbirds, the common connection there demonstrates that, back in their heyday, the Deathbirds ministered over all aspects of death. They dealt with both body and soul. So their influence remains relevant no matter which aspect of death you're dealing with, even in the modern day. Still though, what's the deal with all the headlessness? The Guardians are headless, and so are the demigods. Even the horses are. I think the purpose is to achieve an irregular soul binding, different from the usual kind. Here's a difficult question. Precisely which part of the body binds the soul? We can't know, but it's pretty intuitive that it might be the head. That is where the brains normally are. Thematically, there's some backing too. Eyes are obviously right there in the head, and they're huge windows to the soul in Elden Ring. Head hair, too, has a lot of significance, possibly caused by its proximity to souls. Even when they're in dilapidated statue mode, Marika and Radigan still have their signature hair, perhaps for this same reason. Note also how Marika's busted head needs to be put back on for the Elden Ring to appear, which makes sense if the Elden Ring is attached to her soul, and her soul is bound by her head. So what is the point of the beheading ritual? It leaves a maximum of flesh, which cannot bind a soul in the normal way. The resulting body is missing just that piece. Maybe a so-called cursed soul, which normally can't bind a body, can then take residence. If it does so, it seems to grant teleportation powers, which is always helpful. The case of Lutel seems to support this. She seems to have undergone at least 3 different death rituals. Her head was removed and her body successfully bound by a cursed soul, giving it teleportation and Prince of Death's flame powers. The head, meanwhile, was presumably Erdtree buried. That would still return her soul to the Erdtree, which seems like it would be the main point of that particular ritual. This does mean that these headless soldiers are not exactly possessed by their own original souls. But the significance of this is unclear, since apparently the mind is not merely a part of the soul. So why are these demigods beheaded? Could it be related to what may be a stray Godwin head found underneath Stormveil Castle? No, I think that's a different story entirely. The demigods in the Mausolea are headless for the same reason their guardians are. It seems that demigods are somewhat different from normal people in some fundamental way. A demigod's flesh is special, and so is their soul. That means the point of the headless demigods is to bind a cursed demigod soul. It's to bind the soul of Godwin, give it flesh once again. His demigod soul can't bind to just anyone's headless body, it has to be a demigod body. A common cursed soul easily binds to a normal person's headless body, if the right ritual is used. Cursed demigod souls, by contrast, are quite rare, so a fair number of these demigod bodies are scattered throughout the lands between, not binding anything. Considering the close ties between souls and information, perhaps it's appropriate that an intended receptacle for a demigod's soul can be used to make a copy of the remembrance of a great being. I also wonder whether this particular coffin design is more than decorative. There's a suggestive crown-like piece right where the head should be. Does it relate to trying to attract a soul? I've seen similar designs in a few places. Deep in Elphael, and Mikla is of course heavily involved in the Godwin Eclipse plan. They're also in Raya Lucaria, and sorcerers have a history of all kinds of exotic soul bindings. Revenants are just one of many examples, but I'm just grasping at straws here. Anyway, despite all that, Godwin's soul never did come back. It supposedly requires an eclipse. Apparently, that hasn't panned out. By the way, this is just speculation, but if the headless troops are at all analogous, then maybe their creation requires a lunar eclipse rather than a solar eclipse. Those could be much more common. But what's gone wrong? Castle Sol is the nexus of this eclipse ritual. Interestingly, Castle Sol has these so-called spectral soldiers who look just like the headless ones, except they do have heads. They can still teleport around, too, so it seems like a more advanced version. Castle Sol is cutting edge. Achieving this may have required torturing a bunch of Albinorics, though. Well, blood may be the medium through which these cursed souls are bound. Blood certainly has many magical applications in the lands between. The Omen twins both obsess over their own fiery blood. And one infamous thing about Albinorics is their strange silver blood, and how they manage to be alive despite that. So there is a certain logic to using them to create a new sort of soul binding. So that may be a sort of success story, but the eclipse itself was a failure. Why is this? I don't have a firm answer yet. Instead, let me share a grab bag of thoughts. One thought that occurs is that an eclipse requires something to occlude the sun, typically a moon. So maybe Lunar Princess Rani intervened. After all, if the point of the eclipse is to bring a demigod soul back to the lands between, maybe Rani's dark moon participated in the eclipse, but instead brought her soul back, and that's how she came to be bound to a doll body. If so, then she screwed Godwyn twice over. She got his soul evicted, and then prevented it from coming back. But I don't know, that doesn't relate too cleanly to the mechanics of a cursed soul. And the disappointed ghost in Castle Sol says the sun wasn't swallowed at all, so it sounds like there was no eclipse. Furthermore, supposedly what the eclipse does is ward off destined death. That doesn't sound that related to Rani's soul. It does sound somewhat related to Godwyn's soul. It's a pretty strange line though. Destined death is largely sealed. It doesn't really need to be warded off. Maybe this whole concept is an old Sun Realm ritual from the ancient time before even the Golden Order, when destined death was more of an everyday concern. So maybe it was always doomed to fail in the modern day. But Miquella seems quite invested in this eclipse plan, and given his supposed level of insight, it's hard to believe he would fundamentally misunderstand the current nature of the Elden Ring. I think he would know that an old ritual like that is not applicable anymore. Another idea is that, thanks to Radahn, celestial bodies aren't processing as they once did. That could prevent eclipses. But again, I think Miquella would be smart enough to observe this fact and not wait around for an eclipse that just wasn't going to come. But maybe Radahn only began to hold back the stars in the middle of this plan. Now that's an interesting thought. Maybe that even explains why Malenia later went all the way down to Caelid and fought Radahn. Maybe Miquella really wanted the stars unstuck. Well, as I said, I'm not at all firm on that, it's just vague ideation. Anyway, this is supposed to be about omens. Omens are supposed to be portents. Just what do omens portend? They bring cursed souls out into the open when they might otherwise be very obscure. Have they been a prediction about the state Godwyn would end up in this entire time? They could be, but I'm not so sure. I don't think they're so specific. They'd be relevant even if nothing major ever went wrong. No shattering, no Night of Black Knives, maybe even if the Age of Plenty had continued forever. Nonetheless, apparently there are some souls that are said to be cursed, which just exit the system and then remain outside of it. Over time, these would accumulate, even if there were no big catastrophes like a demigod soul becoming cursed. The accumulation would eventually become an important situation which has to be addressed. I think this is what omens portend. The cursed souls are there, and they don't fit into the system, but you're gonna have to deal with them eventually. Perhaps Godwyn and his mending rune could be a release valve to that situation. Or would it? I really haven't said how I think the mending rune of the Death Prince was formed, nor just what effect it would have. Death in the lands between is such an enormously multifaceted topic. I've barely touched on those who live in death, as well as the Deathbirds and their ancient rituals and bygone significance, but I've laid out some interesting tools here and applied them to some parts of the lore. I bet they'll continue to pay dividends as I investigate further along these lines and others.